poetry was always a great love of mine. I'd gloss over some poems, I might dwell on others. Some of them I print off, but I suppose before computers, I wrote a lot of them out by hand. And over the years, I've accumulated quite a lot here. This is my archival folder, very special. But some people collect stamps, and I just collect poems. But reading poetry is like going out to Belvedere or going out to Lough. Every time you read or recite a poem, you see something different in it. And each person has their own interpretation. But poems, they're accessible to everybody. Sure, for thousands of years, people have been writing down their thoughts or feelings. They have put them in words called poetry. And the earliest poetry is believed to have been recited or sung. Some of it was even done in a chant or a rap. It was often used as a way of remembering things in law or in history. But we've always had poetry in some form in our lives. Early primary school, or even before that, you would remember things like Hickory Dickory Dock or Incy Wincy Spider. But in primary school, there's one that stuck with me. It wasn't even one that I was meant to learn, but I was in a 2-teacher school in the country, and so I was in the master's room, and there was a lovely new teacher next door with all sorts of fine ideas who sang and loved music. Now, we never sang, but she did like 2 and 2 is 4, 2 and 2 is 4, hee-ho-dee-a-dee-oh, 2 and 2 is 4. I thought that was bliss. How well I remember that. I don't remember the history we were doing, but I do remember that. And then we went on to secondary school and we had little rules like I before E except after C. I still remember that one. And when I went on to study, then I was doing biology as well, and in food science we had this lovely little one. It's a very odd thing, as odd as can be, that whatever Miss T eats turns into Miss T. Don't forget that one. So when I was young, we nearly always learned poetry by heart. If it rhymed, it was easier to remember, but most of us learned by rote learning at that stage, and that's when we got used to it. Now, the poems that I'm going to do today are the ones I treasure most now, and the ones I treasure most now are the ones that evoke a particular feeling or a memory for me. Most of them, all of them I'm doing today happen to be Irish authors or poets. That's just a coincidence. Now, the first one is Seamus Heaney. He's a wonderful poet and a playwright, and he only died in 2013. But I think that he wrote about family and love and ordinary life like nobody else. And during lockdown, I heard lots of lovely stories about homeschooling and picnics in the sitting room and children learning to bake with their parents. So there were lots of very special memories created. And this poem is about Seamus Heaney folding the sheets with his mother, like the bed linen. Now, for you and me, it could be anybody, with anybody, but Seamus Heaney had a particularly close relationship with his mother. And I think when he wrote, there was such depth in the simplicity of his words. And this one is called The Cool That Came Off Sheets Just Off the Line. The cool that came off sheets just off the line made me think the damp must still be in them. But when I took my corners of the linen and pulled against her, first straight down the hem, and then diagonally, and then flapped and shook the fabric like a sail in the cross wind, they made a dried out, undulating twack. So we'd stretch and fold and end up hand in hand for a split second, as if nothing had happened. For nothing that had not happened beforehand, day by day, just touch and go, coming close again by holding back, in moves where I was X and she was O, inscribed in sheets she'd sewn from ripped out flour sacks. Now I remember when I was about 8 or 9, I went to my first mission in the church. And I did a few more after that. But the missioners used to visit parishes every few years. And, well, there was fire and brimstone. But in a small country church, like the missioner, when he'd be giving his sermon, he could come right down to the altar rails rather. And when he'd get into his sermon, like he'd spit out the words with venom. And you could be right there, an 8-year-old in the side aisle. But years and years later, I discovered a poem called Memories of the Mission. I think it was John O'Brien wrote it, but it evoked so many memories for me that I actually learned it off. All 10 long verses. Now, I'm not going to do all 10 verses. I won't tell it all to you, but I'll tell you 3 of the most graphic because I know them so well. I remember well the missioners who came from Dublin town, impressive looking figures in their big long robes of brown. They had no amplifiers then, and although the church was full, these fellas didn't need it. They could holler like a bull. Well, they had sermons about honesty and sermons about faith, and they'd be quick to remind you that your prayer life wasn't great. They spoke about the devil, but the memory that remained is the sermon of the devil's work in dark and lonely lanes. There was one big wicked preacher I remember very well, who asked the congregation if they wished to go to hell. If anyone among you wants to languish in the flames, stand up and let us see you, and let us have your names. Well, no one moved a finger for a minute, aye or more. Then up stood Mickey Dooley, he was sitting by the door. Well, it isn't that I'm going to hell, said Mickey with a moan, but I'd hate to see his reverend standing up there on his own. And out along the footpath there would always be a stand with medals of St. Christopher, that's the fellow that was banned, 100 different rosary beads, some big ones and some small, and lots of holy pictures too to hang upon the wall. I got a little casket once from poor old Uncle Pius. Inside was Blessed Martin, the image of that boxer Joe Lewis. And once I got a present of a little toy clock. And when you held it up before the light, you could see the church at knock. It didn't do us any harm, actually. Now, you might remember Pat Inglesby. It's hard to believe he's 79 years of age now, but he used to be a children's TV show presenter, and he wrote plays, he published books of short stories, and he was also a newspaper columnist. But he thought deeply about issues, and I always liked his sentiments. And he wrote this poem for an 11-year-old girl with Down syndrome. Her name is Rita. I got the poem from this book, which I bought many years ago. The page falls open. It's probably a little dated, but I still love it and I go back to it very, very often. This poem is called For Rita with Love. You came home from your special school in a special bus, full of people who look like you and love like you. And you met me for the first time and you loved me. You love everybody so much that it's not safe to let you out alone. 11 years of love and trust and time for you to learn that you can't go on loving like this. Unless you are stopped, You will embrace every person you see. Normal people don't do that. Some normal people will hurt you very badly because you do. Some people don't look nice, but you embrace them. You kissed a wino on the bus and he broke down and cried and he said, "Nobody has kissed me for the last 30 years. But you did. You touched my face with your fingers and you said, 'I like you.' The world will never be ready for you. Your way is right and the world will never be ready. We could learn everything that we need to know by watching you, going to your special school in your special bus, full of people who look like you and love like you, and it's not safe to let you out alone. If you're not normal, there is very little hope for the rest of us. Now, Vona Gruark is a very interesting poet. She was actually born near here, she's from Edgeworthstown, or Moss-Trim, and I have been a fan of Vona's work since she first started writing. I love the way she kind of scrupulously deals or gives attention to small objects and individual words. And this is a gas little poem called "Why I Am Not a Nature Poet." And I suppose anybody who has or had goldfish in their houses will understand it. Why I am not a nature poet has a lot to do with Max and Nemo. Scarcely out of their plastic bag 3 weeks ago and into our new fishbowl when Nemo started swelling up. Spiking pineapple fins and lying sideways like a drunk in a gutter, lipping some foul-mouthed shanty to the moon. Dropsy, Ed in the pet centre said, who 3 weeks ago swore they could live for 15 years. Put him in the freezer, kill him quick, don't leave him in the bowl or to rot, or the other one will eat him and die too. I buy drops instead that cost what 3 new goldfish would. Eve makes a get well Nemo card and talks to him when she passes, calling him little guy and Goldilocks, playing For Nemo on her keyboard. I don't know. Max, I think, fine-tunes his hunger and has a bloodless, sly look to him now. He knows I'm on to him. I tap the glass, shoo him away whenever I see him closing in on Nemo's wide-eyed slump. But I can't stand sentinel all night. I'm in the kitchen when I hear the shout. Come up and see what's going on. I take the stairs 2 at a time, ordering the right words in my head. Choice, fault, nature, destiny. Eve's face is level with the fish and behind the bowl so it's magnified, amazed like an open moon. Max is nudging Nemo, she says. He's helping him turn round. I think there's more to that than goldfish. Now the next one is Percy French. I know it's all old, but I'm old. I think Percy French was great. William Percy French he was born as, and he lived or was born in Tulsk, County Roscommon. Now he studied engineering in college, but to be honest with you, he spent most of his time there writing songs, doing amateur dramatics, playing his banjo, and doing watercolour painting. He was kind of what you'd call an all-rounder, but he's best known for his jaunty songs and poems. It's hard to believe that even though he died in 1920, His songs are still popular today. At any gathering you'll hear Abdullah Bulbul Amir, Are You Right There Michael, Fill the Fluther's Ball, The Mountains of Mourne, and Come Back Paddy Riley to Ballyjames Duff. There are pages of his work. But this is a jaunty little poem he wrote, and it's called Och, I Dunno. And it's another one that I kind of latched onto. Och, I Dunno. I'm simply surrounded by lovers since Damedy's fortune in land. They're coming in droves like the plovers to axe for me hand. There's clerks and policemen and teachers, some sandy, some black as a crow. Ma says you get used to the creatures. Sure, I don't know. The convent is in a commotion to think of me taking the spouse, and they wonder I hadn't the notion of taking the vows. That's a beautiful life and a quiet, and it keeps you from going below. As a girlie, I thought I might try it. Sure, I don't know. I've none but myself to look after. Aye, in marriage it fills me with fears. I think I'd have less of the laughter and more of the tears. But I'll not be a slave like my mother. She had 8 of us all in a row. Even one little baby's a bother. I don't know. There's a lad that has taken me fancy. I know he's a bit of a limb, and though marriage is terrible chancy, I'd chance it with him. He's coming tonight, oh, I tingle from the top of me head to me toe. I'll tell him I'd rather stay single. But I don't know. Jaunty little thing. Now we're moving into a sort of more modern era, I suppose. But this Gillian Hamill lady, I've discovered her a few years ago. Not any relations to the Hamills we know, but she was born in Derry actually, but she's lived in Dublin for about 13 years. And she's not just a poet, but she's an actor, and she's a journalist, and actually she's the editor of Shelf Life magazine. Now, she has a very unique style of writing, and I like lots of her poems, but the poem that I picked, it's actually tiny, but it says a lot, and it's called Pot Plant. A wilted pot plant sits on the windowsill, a sick, wilted, fragile pot plant. And yet, even this dusty, dejected, hewn stalk could grow if someone loved it enough to water it. Now, that's deeper than you think. So, I think we all agree on one thing. The canal came into its own during lockdown, and it brought me back to another poem that I always loved, and now I really understand it. Canal Bank Walk was written by Patrick Kavanagh immediately after he was recovering from major surgery. And from then on, his poetry changed track from criticism and frustration to praise of life and nature, and sort of looking at the world through a new lens. And this particular poem deals with a theme of renewal and recovery. And walking by the canal, even actually this morning, I felt it especially that I felt exactly that, a sense of renewal and recovery. Now the beach that's mentioned in this poem is the tree and not the other. Canal Bank Walk. Leafy with love banks and the green waters of the canal, pouring redemption for me, that I do the will of God, wallow in the habitual, the banal, grow with nature again as before I grew. The bright stick trapped, the breeze adding a third party to the couple kissing on an old seat, and a bird gathering materials for the nest, for the word eloquently new and abandoned to its delirious beat. O unworn world, enrapture me, encapture me in a web of fabulous grass and eternal voices by a beach. Feed the gaping need of my senses. Give me ad lib to pray unself-consciously with overflowing speech, for this soul needs to be honoured with a new dress, woven from green and blue things and arguments that cannot be proven. As I say, poetry is accessible to everybody, but there's no doubt that poets have a special gift. And when we read a poet's work, even that last one there, Canal Bank, it should change us. It should change you. Sometimes you may need to read a poem 3 times. If the first time you read it and you haven't a clue what it's about, most times now people Google and say, oh, you know, they read up about the poet and they read about the poem and now they know. But actually it's better to read it 3 times. And I promise you that on the 3rd reading, or maybe it might take 23, but if you read it aloud or even in a loud whisper, you will get the meaning, your meaning. Now I hope you enjoyed the poems that I selected for this presentation to celebrate Bealtaine. But speaking of tender moments created during lockdown, this is just part of a poem written by a 12-year-old girl called Eva from Mullingar, and she wrote it on the 24th of April 2020. Lockdown fun. Social distancing and panic buying left the streets and no one flying. Cooking, cleaning and gardening I learned, thankfully without any fingers burned. Cycling down the canal, that's the new way, adding a kilometre every day. A new moonshore, and that's Mr. P. And by the way, that's my daddy. Grandparents are missing our hugs and kisses. They're cocooning all alone and really miss us. Nanny hands us apple sponge through the window. It's truly my favourite. She's my hero. COVID-19 is extremely contagious. All frontline workers are very courageous. Keeping us safe through this hard time, keep them in your hearts, forever in mine. I think it's true to say that poetry is alive and well, and the world is in good hands. Thank you.